Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The valley was not known by name, but by the sound of its brook. People there woke with roosters and worked until stars returned. Beyond the tiled roofs, hills folded like blankets left by giants, thick with moss, nettles, and the smell of rain that never quite dried. That smell followed a small girl everywhere, to the door, to the barn, to the slope behind her grandmother's hut, where herbs hung in bunches, turning the beams into a green curtain of ghosts. The girl's father was a cooper, though there was less work each year. The breweries were buying barrels from the city now. Smoother wood, quicker locks, no hand smell. His hands cracked like bark. Her mother washed linen for the parish house and brought home soap scraps wrapped in rags. No one in those parts was idle, but want still crept into cupboards like smoke through a keyhole. Her grandmother's house smelled of sage and ash. Bottles stood in rows along the wall, clear, amber, and dark, some stoppered with cork, others tied with wax cloth. On good days, children came here with mothers to fetch salves for cracked hands or teas for their men's coughing. On bad days, when the priest left early and windows stayed shut, they came quiet, carrying coins and secrets alike. The child watched from the corner, her knees drawn together, as her grandmother worked by lamplight with steady calm. That old woman's fingers were narrow and sure. She muttered when she stirred, half in Czech, half in words that no one had printed. The girl was told not to repeat them. The villagers called the old woman a healer, sometimes a saint, sometimes something more whispered. Her father frowned when people said the word witch, but he stayed silent, because the little vials did help, and those vials bought bread. Every few days the girl followed the old woman up the hill. The path was muddy, full of roots and shadows. "Listen," the grandmother would say, not to the girl but to the air around them. "The wind tells when a plant is ready." And the girl listened. After a while, she too began to notice how mint hummed brighter in the sun, how wormwood trembled when storms were near. She learned to cut stems without killing them. At night, sitting beside the stove, the grandmother taught her letters carved from herb names, M for marjoram, V for valerian. From those shapes, she built her own understanding of the world, that healing was pattern, not miracle, that there was order even in rot. Sometimes she rubbed petals between her fingers just to see what stayed: color, scent, a trace of warmth, like memory. One winter morning, snow on the windows, the grandmother was sick. She brewed her own medicine and sent the girl to gather nettles by the stream. The water bit with cold, but the stems yielded easily. When the girl came back, her grandmother had fallen asleep, with a smile, the room heavy with rosemary smoke. That day lasted longer than most days that came after. The cooper drank quietly that evening, his hammer still, and her mother folded clothes without a word. Spring returned, and with it the work. The girl carried herbs to market for her mother to sell. Her hands grew quicker, her sense sharper. She understood which people would be generous, which would haggle until evening, which would keep your basket and forget to pay. That knowledge did not make her bitter. It made her careful. When she grew near grown, her grandmother called her to the narrow table and placed upon it a small glass vial. Inside lay something golden, clear, faintly sweet-smelling. "Never use this," the old woman said. "It heals nothing. It only ends." The girl nodded. The vial was sealed in wax and set among harmless tonics. She dusted it now and then, but never asked. The year her grandmother died, the funerals came quick. Fevers swept through 2 nearby farms, and the bell tolled each dawn. The priest preached about patience and providence. People whispered instead about curses. The girl, standing by the church door, felt both. Wonder and fear sit easily together when one is young. Work filled the emptiness. She cleaned the shelves, made infusions, joined her mother in the candlelit kitchen. The old recipes changed slightly as she mixed them. A little more mint for bitterness, a bit less alcohol for the poor. And by doing so, she found a sort of peace. She liked the rhythm: heat, stir, pour, cool. When caravans passed through with city merchants, she sometimes saw curiosities, glass instruments shaped like moons, dyes that turned cloth deep blue. She dreamed of learning proper medicine, the kind written in catalogs, but knew dreams, like tinctures, must be measured, or they sour. Years went by in the narrow valley, slow and circular. Once, she found a bird caught in one of her father's hoops. Its wing was twisted, but with time, she set it straight and let it go. It flew so quickly, she almost doubted it had been broken at all. That memory stayed with her every winter after. The fragile thing, the patient work, the release. She left the village quietly one misty morning. No farewells were made. There were chores enough to fill silence. Her mother pressed a pouch of dried nettles into her hand, saying only, "For luck." The road to Prague smelled of mud and thawed earth. She walked until the bells of the city rose faint behind chimneys, where roofs overlapped like scales of some sleeping animal. The city was louder, impatient, filled with soot and arguments. But herbs still grew in its gardens, and people still ached, and hands like hers were still needed. So she took a room above a shoemaker's shop, laid her bundles on the table, and began again. Quietly, as all worthwhile things begin. Morning in the city began with water slapping stone basins and vendors shouting from half-open shutters. The quarter where the herbalist lived belonged neither to the poor nor to the rich. It was a place for those who rose early and returned home late, their hands smelling of metal, dough, ink, or dust. The street curved like a spine between 2 squares, and its air stayed thick with smoke from bakeries and the slow sweetness of roasted barley. Her room stood above the shoemaker's shop, walls uneven, plaster yellowed with age. She rented space enough for a bed, a stove, and shelves holding jars of dried roots. Downstairs, the shoemaker's hammer struck steadily, a heartbeat for the building. Life was modest, yet she considered it a kind of luck to wake and know that her own work awaited her. not another's command. Each morning, she carried her basket through crooked alleys to the market. The cobbles there had soaked up centuries of rain and gossip. Around her stood the stalls of others who, like her, traded in small, necessary miracles: a baker's crusty loaves, a tinker's repaired locks, a widow's lace. She spread her cloth, weighed bundles of chamomile and angelica, and waited. It was not a trade for quick fortunes, but for steady hearts and careful eyes. Her customers were mostly women who had children, aches, or both. They trusted her not because she promised cures, but because she listened. To one, she recommended a poultice for bad knees. To another, a tea to calm a sleepless mind. She wrote nothing down, yet remembered every ailment, every repeat visit. When a merchant offered to sell her colored glass jars at triple the price, she smiled and declined. She still used bottles from her grandmother's hut, washed smooth by years of boiling water. The widow who owned the shop next door leaned on her doorframe often, talking of times gone and husbands lost. Through such conversations, she learned how quickly stories traveled in the city, how praise one day could become mockery the next. Words had wings, and no kindness to spare. She grew cautious with speech, but generous with silence. It made her seem wiser than she thought herself to be. In the afternoons, she dried herbs on her windowsill, careful that soot did not cling to their surface. The rooftops around her glimmered with coal dust that turned white linen gray within a day. Still, she tended her craft as if she lived under open sky. Her humor surfaced quietly when she called stubborn nettles her best apprentices, or joked that the mint prayed louder than the church bells. The humor protected her from bitterness. Her clientele widened as months turned. Messengers came for tonics, soldiers for liniments, clerks for headaches born of counting ledgers. Now and then, someone in polished boots entered, asking politely complicated questions: where she had studied, which doctor had trained her. She bowed her head and said that her learning came from honest soil. Some nodded, others smiled without warmth. People with authority liked the scent of knowledge, but not too much of it in another's hands. One afternoon, a mason's apprentice arrived, balancing a heavy basket of gravel before stopping at her stall. His shirt was rolled to the elbow, his grin crooked, his fingers cracked but clean. He asked for comfrey, pretending he needed it for a friend's injured foot. She handed him a small packet, and he stood there longer than necessary, squinting at the labels as if they contained secrets. He began to come often after that, bringing jars, fixing the latch on her stall, leaving gifts of bread. His attention was shy, not clumsy. She accepted it as one might accept spontaneous spring weather, neither trusting nor resenting it. Some evenings, after the market closed, she took the long way home through the Charles Bridge, where the river's murmur mixed with song. To the west, the hill gardens held glows of orange light from villas. Below, the city bellows breathed smoke and glass. She thought of her grandmother then, of patience as the only currency that never devalued. The city demanded rush, but her trade allowed slowness. People might call her a relic of old ways, yet they kept returning when fevers rose or grief became too heavy to swallow. Rent and taxes took more than half her earnings. The rest went to barley soup, coals, and paper for notes she never showed anyone. Sometimes she wrote the names of plants and their virtues on scraps, not to publish, but to remember. She liked the way ink curved, how each line carried intention without sound. Words, she found, could heal as much as salves if handled gently. The constables often wandered the marketplace, hats tipped low, eyes searching for sellers of bad meat or false measures. Once, one approached her table, joking that her mixtures could stir more than sleep. His tone half flirted, half warned. She replied mildly that herbs poisoned only those who wished to see poison. He laughed and walked off, but she noticed later how buyers hesitated the rest of the day. To trade in healing was to flirt always with suspicion. When trade dwindled, she visited the poorer quarters, leaving behind small packets without charge. Some of those who received them left coins at her door weeks later. Some did not. She did not keep account. A thing freely given, she thought, always returns in some form, even if only in quiet sleep. As autumn deepened, she began mixing soaps scented with lavender to sell alongside her cures. The scent softened the air of her room, and guests remarked on how calm it felt within those worn walls. The widow downstairs teased that the smell brought customers faster than remedies ever could. She almost believed it. Late in the year, as frost touched the windows, she opened her old chest and found the sealed vial her grandmother had given her. The wax was still firm, the liquid inside untouched. She thought briefly of what it might contain, the warning that it healed nothing. For a heartbeat, a strange curiosity whispered that to know every plant's gift, one must also know its danger. Then the stove cracked, reminding her of practical matters, and the vial returned to the chest beneath folded linens. Life settled again into rhythm. Dawn markets, brief laughter, quiet dinners. When the mason's apprentice brought her a wooden box of his own making, carved with small leaves, she smiled and placed her balances inside it. She told him she could not promise more than friendship, but friendship, she said, keeps better than wine. He laughed as if she had made a jest. Evenings passed in warmth and solitude. Sometimes she listened to music drifting from neighboring taverns, the notes slipping through shutters like melted butter. She would lie awake then, thinking how knowledge, like melody, could soothe or wound, depending on who wielded it. Winter came with its gray skies and slower trade. Her coins stacked thin, but she did not despair. Each difficulty was measured against what she had already endured: hunger, cold, loss, and the ache of being misunderstood. Those, she reasoned, were common trials, ordinary as herbs in a meadow. One night, unable to sleep, she looked from her window toward the faint outline of the cathedral towers. A cart rolled by, horses steam-breathed in the cold, wheels rattling like bones. Somewhere, unseen, a bell struck the hour. She felt smaller than time itself, and yet deeply part of the world's quiet order, as though every dried leaf in her room, every breath drawn from the stove's warmth, was accounted for in the sum of existence. In the stillness, she whispered a brief thought, not quite prayer, not quite wish, that her hands might never bring harm through ignorance nor pride. The words lingered for a breath, then dispersed with the smoke curling up the chimney. Morning would come again, full of clatter and barter and cautious laughter. She would set her scales, weigh leaves, listen to coughs, write what the day taught her. Life moved like her mortar's circle, endless, deliberate, and comforting in its repetition. Within that quiet circle, her future waited, still unseen but already near. Spring crept into Prague quietly that year. It did not announce itself with flower stalls or parades, but with the faint, wet scent of thawed stone. The Vltava no longer mirrored ice. Its surface trembled like wool under a breeze. The herbalist felt that same looseness within herself, an unease that grew with the river's restless hum. Trade had been steady through the winter. The mason's apprentice still carried her supplies on occasion, and she, in turn, gave him teas for his cough. But lately, he had not come. Days stretched thin and soundless, and the city felt larger than before, its alleys coagulated with gossip. The first death went unnoticed. A laundress on the south bank, her skin tinged strangely at the lips, found slumped beside the tub. People said she'd slipped, struck her head. The second was a clerk at the brewery offices, fallen over the ledgers. Only when the third was buried, a student from across the river, did murmurs begin. The same stillness at their end, the same faint bruise around the mouth, the same serene pose, like sleepers who had simply forgotten to wake. In the marketplace, whispers buzzed more than flies. Some said a fever crept from the river water, others that someone had cursed the city. The herbalist listened, sorting nettles, pretending not to care. But when she heard the name of the mason's apprentice among the dead, her hands went still. She asked no questions aloud. Grief prefers silence. That evening, she closed the shutters early, lit her stove, and took down her grandmother's old notebook. The symptoms described by rumor, the drowsiness, the chill, the faint smile, were too exact, too practiced. They matched the traces of one poison she knew by color and by scent. Monkshood, distilled to its purest oil. Few still remembered how to prepare it, fewer still how to conceal its fragrance. It was rare, expensive, and useless except to those who understood its craft. She had seen it once, that sealed golden vial, hidden under folded linen. She recalled the warning, "It heals nothing." Now the phrase came back not as caution, but as confirmation. The next morning she walked to the apothecary's quarter, her basket empty. At one corner, city constables spoke with a physician about the deaths. They argued softly, their words muffled by the noise of carts. She caught fragments: nerve poisoning, unknown tincture, accidental ingestion. The apothecary's window displayed neat rows of bottles, all labeled in Latin script she now partly understood. Inside, the air smelled too clean, too tidy, as if truth had been distilled with the alcohol. She purchased camphor and dried sage with trembling fingers. The young clerk behind the counter looked nervous, perhaps sensing what she already suspected, that anyone who dealt with herbs might soon become an object of doubt. When she returned home, the widow downstairs muttered of inspectors demanding lists of ingredients. For the first time, she locked her cabinet. Days turned slow and heavy. News of more deaths traveled through the muddy lanes. Rich clients sent servants instead of coming themselves. People glanced at her hands when she passed, as though they might glow with guilt. Yet her skill, the very thing that drew suspicion, was also her defense. Late at night she began her own silent accounting. Which clients had bought tinctures from her, whose mixtures might have been stolen or copied. She remembered the young scholar who sometimes stopped at her stall, asking questions about her methods, offering to exchange rare seeds. He had mentioned that he once studied the poisonous family of plants for classification. His manner had been gentle, deliberate. She had liked his company. Now she wondered if curiosity had grown sharper than conscience. The city became a place of lowered voices and locked doors. Priests preached simpler sermons. Taverns emptied early. Rain salted the windows, the sound steady and flat. Alone in her workshop, she crushed leaves and compared their scent against what memory could not forget. Monkshood, or wolfsbane, smelled faintly of earth turned by a spade, nothing uncommon to a gardener's nose. But its oil ran like water and killed like silence. She recalled how her grandmother had said that its deadliest form looked clearest, that its virtue was invisibility. She needed facts, not fears. So she tested samples from her own shelf, pricking each root lightly with a pin dipped in vinegar, watching the reaction on paper. All behaved as expected. Nothing deceived her. She took comfort in that small order amid spreading disorder. When the constables questioned the market traders, they gathered her name with the others. She stood in the hall of municipal offices, the smell of ink thick around her. The inspector asked her about toxic extracts. She answered that in untrained hands, even parsley could harm. He smiled without warmth. It was the same look men of titles gave to women who spoke with certainty. Afterward, she walked home through drizzle, aware of how quickly knowledge can turn from gift to burden. Customers grew fewer still. The baker's wife crossed the street to avoid greeting her. Coins dwindled, yet the jars on her sill remained as bright and whole as ever. Work had always been her compass, but now every motion seemed weighted with scrutiny. Still, she persisted. Healing for her was as much habit as charity. Then came the evening when a timid knock sounded at her door. A boy, perhaps 12, stood there, drenched, holding a folded note against his chest. The writing inside was clean and narrow. The scholar requested her presence at his rooms near the university. An inquiry about medicinal classification, nothing urgent. She almost discarded it, yet the wording rang oddly formal, as if written under pressure. She went the next day, cloak drawn tight, passing between rows of shuttered windows. His lodging stood above a printer's shop. He greeted her kindly, but with a strange restraint. Books lay open, notes scattered like molted feathers. On his desk sat a row of small bottles, one of which caught the light with a familiar gleam, blue glass, narrow neck. He noticed her glance. "A university sample," he said, almost too quickly. "Left by a colleague. You may examine it if you wish." She did not touch it. Something in the angled script on its label pricked memory. The same hand that had once ordered soporific teas from her stall, using words too specific for coincidence. They spoke little after that. Conversation trembled between politeness and mistrust. She left with a strange calm that hid storm beneath it. Back home, she sat by her stove long after the embers had dimmed, the city murmuring outside like a restless beast. Grief for the dead tangled with dread for the living. She thought of the mason's apprentice, of the soldier, the laundress. Each had trusted their city, their routines, their own small faith in kindness. The same faith she now questioned in herself. Trust, she realized, was a garden too easily poisoned from within. Rain continued through the night. In its steady rhythm, the room seemed to breathe, walls expanding and contracting like tired lungs. She thought of gathering evidence, of warning others, yet every path of justice appeared to pass first through danger. Knowledge born from the earth could expose the hand that misused it, but it could also destroy the messenger. She chose patience, watching, listening, waiting for what truth would reveal itself in time. The veneer of peace in Prague thinned with each passing day. Bells tolled more often. Carriages slowed at corners where cholera once had been whispered. Sometimes she saw constables' carts near the river, carrying away bodies with a quiet that felt rehearsed. Above all, she noticed the silence of officials, that delicate, deliberate absence of curiosity, which means they already know and prefer not to. Within her, something hardened, not pride, but resolve. She would observe without announcing. She would use the same caution she did when cutting potent roots. Steady hand, breathing held, no sudden movements. She began to mark small observations in the margins of her papers. Initials of victims, days of purchase, approximate areas of their dwelling. The pattern, faint at first, began to form a ring about the university quarter. Her workroom now carried 2 scents, one of herbs, the other, sharper, of unease. Yet beneath it lay that old, patient rhythm of life, measured by the mortar's sound and the soft thud of the pestle. Night after night she wrote quietly in her ledger, while outside the rain ceased and fog rose. It was the fog that would come to define those months. Gentle by sight, lethal by what it hid. No one came to her stall for 3 days in a row. On the 4th, a stranger arrived, a woman in fine gloves asking for cough syrup. When the herbalist poured the liquid into a glass vial, she noticed the woman's gloves were damp from the river air, stained faintly blue with the fingertips. The sight froze her heart for an instant. She said nothing and handed the bottle, then watched as the woman disappeared into the crowd. By nightfall, she sat again by her stove, the lid of her chest open, the sealed golden vial she had carried since youth now before her on the table. The light caught in its curve just so. A single drop of time trapped forever between fear and understanding. She turned it once in her palm and felt the quiet hum of destiny's pulse. Outside, Prague breathed heavier than the river. Somewhere, a watchman's horn echoed, distant and uncertain. The herbalist rested her hand upon the vial and whispered to the dark, not prayer, not defiance, but a promise to follow truth patiently, even if it slept behind locked doors. Then, with calm precision, she began to write again, beginning a list that would one day lead her into the deepest chambers of the city's heart, where silence itself had roots. The mornings grew quieter after the fog settled along the river. Even the gulls sounded muted, as if they too were weary of calling into such thick air. Markets opened late, shutters half drawn. The herbalist still rose before dawn, lighting her small lamp with deliberate calm. The color of the city had changed since spring. It had dimmed, not from weather alone, but from suspicion coiling around every conversation. People now measured distances not by steps, but by how far whispers could travel. Her name had appeared once in a pamphlet sold by the printer down the lane. Something about unlicensed remedies and the danger of rural witchcraft. She bought a copy to read her own accusation. Half-truths, thinly veiled warnings. The words amused her more than they stung. The past had always watched her from a corner. This was merely another glance. Yet such publicity could starve a person faster than poverty. Customers spoke less, bought less, and crossed themselves more often when passing her window. Still, work did not vanish entirely. There were always joints that ached or dreams that refused to let people sleep. She brewed teas for those who dared return and saw in their faces both gratitude and fear. That human mixture more potent than any elixir. In the evenings, she washed her hands so often the skin cracked, not from guilt but from habit, trying to erase every trace of the day's rumors. She had begun keeping her small notes more neatly. The ledger that once carried lists of herbs now bore another set of names, written in a careful, slanted script. The victims, their addresses, and where they had lived in relation to the river. It was as if the map of her city were being redrawn by silence. Each mark seemed to pull her further into a pattern she both wanted and dreaded to understand. The scholar whose polite gestures had once eased her doubts now filled her thoughts with unease. His letters arrived irregularly, short as though written under watching eyes. When she visited, his library smelled of damp paper. He spoke of a missing colleague, a man connected with the supply of medicinal tinctures to certain wealthier families. The scholar's own hands had begun to tremble when turning pages. He claimed that notes from their shared university experiments had been stolen weeks ago. In another life, she might have pitied him without caution, but now she measured every gesture. She started to suspect that the deaths were born not of madness, but of carelessness polished into secrecy. Someone playing alchemist, with motives too human to name. Among the few who still greeted her was the printer. He often stood smoking near his door, his fingers blackened with ink. When she asked why the pamphlet had mentioned her, he shrugged and said, "Print followed rumor, and rumor followed coin." His answer was neither cruel nor kind. He later pressed into her hands an unused form bearing the city seal, suggesting she file a formal complaint if she wished her name cleared. She thanked him, but did nothing. In Prague, truth often moved slower than decay. Autumn deepened. The leaves along the embankment turned brown as bread crust. When fog lifted briefly, she walked through the streets to observe life continuing, as if the city wished to forget its own sickness. School children still ran past the bakeries. Women haggled over milk. Yet every light-hearted sound seemed anchored to unease. That evening, returning home, she found her door ajar. Inside, nothing appeared stolen, but several bottles stood misplaced, and the drawer containing her grandmother's vial had been opened, the wax seal dented but not broken. She felt neither anger nor fear, only confirmation. Someone had been searching for something known to very few. She tidied the shelf, locked the door, and sat until dawn, watching the lamp's flame tremble like a pulse. The following week brought official attention. 2 constables, their coats damp from mist, appeared at her stall. They spoke politely, but in that particular tone reserved for those judged before being accused. One asked about her knowledge of toxins. She replied that all medicine contained poison in softer measure. Another inquired about her suppliers, about any dealings with the scholar or the university. She handed them her receipt book, though she knew they could not read half the tincture names. They left, promising follow-up. The market fell into silence once they were gone. Her instinct now was caution, not retreat. Each evening she wrote small observations, folding them into the lining of her shawl. The bottles the constables had touched, the lingering scent of ink on their gloves, the flour smudge on one sleeve, perhaps from a bakery near the scholar's lodging. Such details did not yet make sense, but they were seeds of understanding. Nights lengthened. Beneath her window, beggars sometimes sang to keep warm. Their broken voices mixed with the clatter of boots on the cobbled street. In bed she rarely slept. Her mind replayed details. How the poison struck swiftly yet left faces tranquil. How only those tied by trade to the university district had perished. The pattern returned with cruel precision, each new death another circle within the same map. One morning the printer's door remained closed, his shutters nailed. Word spread that he had been arrested for distributing incendiary literature. She suspected that literature had less to do with politics than with whatever he had overheard. That evening she saw a boy carrying bundles of unsold pamphlets into the river's fog. The papers struck the water softly and sank without ripple. Days later she received a folded letter sealed with no name. Inside was a single sentence in neat script: "Trust no purchase of glass sealed blue." The writing resembled the scholar's, though thinner, weaker. She read it twice, then placed it under her lamp to dry. Rain stained the city into muted colors. She continued working, quietly observing those who sought her remedies. Once a merchant's wife requested a tonic to clear the humors. When the herbalist opened a new bottle to pour the mixture, she detected a faint floral sweetness that did not belong. She kept her voice steady, gave the woman a harmless substitute, and after the door closed, she poured the suspicious bottle into the fireplace. The fumes stung her eyes, resembling the old warnings her grandmother had spoken. Death, hiding in fragrance. She understood now that someone in authority had access to her trade networks, someone who buried error in bureaucracy. The scholar, perhaps unknowing, had been part of that chain. He had mentioned once supplying the university infirmary. Its ledgers could hide as much truth as any confession. But she was not yet ready to act. Patience, she reminded herself. Facts first, speech later. Winter approached early. Frost traced the panes, muting even the suspicion in her street. She took subtle comfort in the slow work of cataloging herbs, measuring out each grain of life. The rhythm steadied her when faith wavered. She found herself whispering old sayings again, the kind her grandmother had used, that every poison owns its opposite, that even mistrust can be an ally if kept on a leash. Sometimes she visited the river just before dawn. The water steamed faintly, disguising reflections. There she felt the size of the city pressing against her. Countless people moving, guessing, condemning, praying. It humbled her to think that one pair of unseen hands could alter that entire rhythm. She feared not for her own safety, but for the idea that knowledge, the thing she cherished most, might become instrument of unknowable harm. Her humor, once dry and light, vanished. The widow below noticed her silence and began sending up slices of warm bread as apology for gossip shared too freely. She accepted them without comment. If compassion survived even among cowards, there was hope yet. By year's turn, the deaths had nearly ceased, or the city had ceased counting them. Fear fatigues communities faster than disease. People prefer forgetting. She did not. On her table now lay two lists, one factual, one emotional. The factual showed names, numbers, patterns. The other held her impressions, tremors in a handwriting, changes of tone, the way the constable's gaze avoided the river when speaking of reports. Between both lists rested a single blue glass fragment she had found near the scholar's home, half buried in mud. Rain tapped against the window again, steady as a voice insisting upon memory. She turned the fragment between her fingers, feeling its coolness, its deliberate perfection. Proof required patience, and patience required courage. Both she had inherited with her grandmother's blood. When she finally blew out the lamp, the room smelled faintly of nettles, ink, and resolve. The fog returned to its place along the river, concealing the cobbles, muffling the city's restless heart. Sleep came to her in brief waves, tender and wary, like the cautious trust between knowledge and its keeper. The frost that winter came late and settled lightly, as though the heavens themselves hesitated. The city carried a soft haze, floating between smoke and mist, making every lantern's glow seem distant. In her window, the herbalist's jars gathered this weak light like captured mornings. For the first time in weeks, there was quiet, not peace, but the silence that follows exhaustion. Rumors had dulled, though their shadows still clung to her name in certain doorways. She moved carefully through her days. The winter market was slower, the air full of steam from roasted roots and tallow candles. Most patrons now favored larger apothecaries, their walls marbled and sterile, as if cleanliness alone sold truth. She did not compete. Instead, her stall became more a refuge than a trade. Those still coming sought privacy, not prescription. When coins thinned, she mended her apron, burned her refuse herbs for warmth, and reminded herself that survival, too, is a skill. One afternoon the scholar reappeared. He looked older, though only months had passed. His hair, once neatly tied, hung uneven. His gloves bore ink stains. He carried a small parcel wrapped in linen and asked if he might talk. She led him upstairs, away from eyes. He spoke little at first, pacing before the stove, then set the parcel on her table and unfolded it. 3 glass bottles, nearly identical, each sealed blue. "These were meant for the infirmary," he said, "all labeled as restorative tonic. I examined one. Its content did not match the register." The bottles shone cold under the lamplight, their color strange, almost cheerful. She tilted one carefully and recognized the faint golden shimmer within. The scholar saw recognition cross her face. His voice trembled. "You know it, then?" She nodded. He did not ask how. They stood for a long while, without speech, as if a shared dread had bound them to stillness. He explained what she had suspected. A supply chain feeding the university's medical stores had been altered somewhere between the archives and delivery. The same hand that falsified labels must have understood the old alchemical recipes. Few could reproduce them accurately. He also feared his own signature had been forged on the papers. Teaching had brought him under official patronage, and official patronage preferred quiet scandals. She listened without interruption. Everything he said confirmed what she had begun to map on her own. The ring, closing around powerful acquaintances, names that would never appear in pamphlets. The scholar's voice thinned. "I wanted to stop them, but the records are gone. It's as though someone tore entire paragraphs from the city's memory." When he left, she watched him vanish into the fog with a pity that surprised her. Once home, she placed one bottle upon her table and the rest in a locked drawer. Its surface caught the lamplight softly, no different in weight or sound from any harmless cordial. Evil, she thought, seldom announces itself. It prefers familiar shapes. In the weeks that followed, she began her patient search. The pattern of supply traced back to 2 addresses, an old workshop near the monastery and a warehouse by the water. At dusk, she would wander past them, appearing as a woman on errands. Through a cracked shutter, she once saw a man she recognized faintly from the square. The same constable who had earlier questioned her. He discussed something with another figure whose coat bore the insignia of the university administration. There was laughter, muffled, careless. The next morning, carts left those buildings bearing crates marked with false tonics. The knowledge pressed heavily upon her chest. Exposing them meant ruin. Staying silent meant complicity. She chose a middle road to gather proof so precise that its voice could not be silenced. Using her rare contacts, she arranged to meet a clerk who still owed her grandmother's debt of gratitude. In the lamplit scriptorium, while the clerk copied account books, she slipped a handwritten note beneath his ledger. "Bring me the original invoices for tonic series marked blue." He did not speak, only nodded once. 2 days later, he left a sealed envelope under a bundle of dried walnut leaves at her stall. The papers revealed what she already knew: signatures forged, dates rewritten, shipments rerouted. Yet printed truth was fragile. She needed something visible, undeniable. She decided to test the bottle itself. For 3 nights, she distilled drops of its contents, using soot-stained glassware that still bore traces of older experiments. The scent bloomed faintly sweet, deceptively harmless. She dipped a feather into the solution. By dawn, its delicate barbs had crisped into dust. She burned the rest, washing her hands until no trace remained. Some days, hope felt close enough to touch. A future where she could walk the market untroubled, her honesty known. Other days, despair whispered that honesty itself was a kind of madness, a labor for fools in a world already arranged. To endure, she followed the only discipline she trusted: routine. She rose, measured, mixed, and recorded. Each act steadied the heart like a pendulum. Word reached her that the scholar had fallen ill, confined to his rooms. Some blamed stress, others a sudden chill. She carried him a jar of broth and found him pale but alert, surrounded by papers. He thanked her weakly, asking if she had kept one of the bottles. When she admitted she had, he smiled faintly. "Keep it hidden. It's safer with you. They think me broken." She left him food and returned home through swirling flakes of snow. That evening, she found another note at her door, written in a new hand. "Stop asking questions. Knowledge can be fatal." She burned it in her stove and watched the ash curl inward upon itself. Fear lingered like smoke but did not stay long. Fear, too, was habitual. One could outlast it. Weeks passed. The constables no longer visited her quarter, yet their absence felt heavier than presence. One morning, a boy brought her an unopened crate from the river warehouse, claiming his master ordered its disposal. Inside lay herbs, crushed glass, and a half-written register, the handwriting elegant, official. She placed it beside her ledger, the 2 lies facing each other like duelists at dawn. That night she revisited her grandmother's warning about knowledge that kills in silence. It struck her differently now, not as mystical menace, but as simple truth. To know and not act was to allow decay to grow roots. Yet haste could poison justice itself. She resolved upon a plan, neither reckless nor passive. She would let those who peddled falseness entangle themselves, while she preserved fragments of the evidence, notes, signatures, the bottle itself. Her task was endurance, not revelation. The days turned damp again. Bread cost more, coal less. The widow downstairs now sold candles scented faintly of lavender, joking that customers preferred calmness to warmth. At times, the herbalist helped pour the tallow, enjoying the small fellowship of work unburdened by deceit. Her humor resurfaced quietly in such company, like a herb sprouting under frost. On one of those evenings, as they poured, the widow mentioned having seen the constable near the Scholars' Street, speaking to an official in a polished carriage. The herbalist listened without reaction, but inside she understood. The circle was closing, not yet around her, but dangerously near. She walked home that night along the river, its surface black as glass. Lanterns quivered upon it like trapped souls. She stopped and looked into her faint reflection. Lines deeper than last winter, eyes steady though tired. Life was changing imperceptibly, shaped less by what she did than by what she refused to ignore. Back home, she opened her chest once more. The blue bottle lay on a folded cloth unchanged. She held it to the lamplight one last time, tracing the curve of its glass. Then she wrapped it carefully in waxed paper and hid it beneath the floorboard. What mattered now was not possession, but preservation. A seed of truth kept safe until the earth was ready for it. When she finally leaned to blow out the lamp, she noticed how the flame bent backward before dying, as if reluctant to leave its warm place among the shadows. Outside, Prague exhaled a frozen wind, and the night smelled of soot, water, and something unspoken. The faint promise that even the darkest mixture could, in patient hands, be turned again toward healing. The thaw that year came with a hiss, not a song. Rain slipped through rooftops, streets bled into the river, and every puddle mirrored a sky the color of pewter. The herbalist's shop stayed damp, her herbs slow to dry. Mold had begun to creep along the corners of walls, despite her daily battle with ash and lime. Yet she felt no urge to complain. For once, discomfort seemed aligned with purpose. The world, like her, was sorting truth from rot. The blue bottle lay hidden, its secret light dimmed beneath the floor. She rarely looked at it now. Knowing it was there steadied her, like a heartbeat too faint to hear, but felt nonetheless. Her time was spent elsewhere, following threads that the scholar, now bedridden, had left unfinished. The city still buzzed with half-truths, though fewer deaths had been reported. Silence was not safety, it was camouflage. Through cautious errands and long observation, she learned that certain ledgers, once compiled by university officials, had vanished into an old noble house near the river bend. That estate, half decayed, had been converted into a municipal archive, where documents supposedly slept forever. But she knew paper never truly slept. It only waited for hands patient enough to turn its pages. The clerk who had once helped her was gone, dismissed under unclear circumstances. Still, he had spoken of a caretaker at the archive, a retired scribe who accepted payment in tobacco and gossip. She set out to meet him on an evening when rain washed the alleyways clean of eavesdroppers. The mansion stood enormous yet tired, its windows blind with grime, its iron gate unlocked, as if indifferent to intrusion. Inside, the air carried the smell of lamp oil, parchment, and quiet despair. The caretaker emerged from the dimness, stooping, his shoulders draped in a coat older than either of them. He did not ask her name. When she offered a pouch of coarse tobacco, he nodded toward a corridor lined with boxes. "Second room on the left," he murmured. "The ones no one signs for." She stepped barefoot inside to keep the floorboards silent. The shelves rose like sleeping giants, layered with dust. Her lantern carved narrow paths of gold through the dark. Some boxes bore dates so faded they might have belonged to another century. The quiet there felt thick enough to sheathe thought itself. She opened several crates before finding what she sought. Correspondence, marked with the university seal and the insignia of the health office. The handwriting was unmistakable, that same elegant hand she had once traced in her ledger, the same that forged the tonic records. But one letter drew her still closer. It was less formal, almost casual. A few quick lines instructing an unnamed assistant to dispose of old alchemical research in the usual manner. Below it, a signet pressed into crimson wax. She did not need to read the name. She had heard it whispered in markets, spoken with deference, a city official of high post, one rumored to own stakes in the river warehouses. The pages trembled slightly in her fingers, not from fear, but from the tension of recognition. The scholar had guessed right. This was the proof that bound misused science to influence and greed. She copied the letter's contents by lamplight, her script neat despite the damp. Before leaving, she replaced each box precisely, wiping her fingerprints with her sleeve. As she turned toward the exit, she noticed a faint reflection in a broken glass pane, the outline of another person at the corridor's mouth. The caretaker, perhaps, or someone less harmless. She extinguished the lantern with a pinch of her fingers and waited for the footsteps to fade. Only when the silence returned did she step out into the rain, keeping her face lowered until the city swallowed her whole. That night she burned the hem of her skirt in the stove to destroy soot marks, and hid her pages behind the stove's bricks, where even inspectors would not think to look. She then walked to the scholar's lodging, bringing bread and broth out of old instinct. He greeted her from bed, his voice hollow but alert. When she recounted what she had found, he closed his eyes and whispered, "So it always ends with the ones who sign, but never touch the substance." In the days that followed, his illness worsened. She suspected no coincidence. He spoke of sleepless nights, of a bitter taste in his water. When she offered to test it, he smiled without bitterness. "They've already begun erasing the page that holds my name," he said. "Soon the city will believe I never lived." After his death, quiet, sudden, unremarked, she visited his room one final time. Among his things, she found only a box of letters bound neatly with cords. Most she left untouched. One she kept. A confession, drafted but never sent, naming no killers, yet implying guilt by absence. It was enough to confirm what she already knew, that the poison had not been sold for malice alone, but for discretion.
a way to remove those who interfered with the profitable exchange of medicines and deaths alike. Spring returned unevenly. The river thawed before the snow vanished from roofs. She grew tired of markets and their false cheer, though she still brewed teas for those in need. Her hands no longer trembled when she measured quantities. Work steadied her, as fact once did. At times, she passed the archive again, noticing fresh guards posted outside. The caretaker never appeared after that night. Some whispered he had gone to the country.
Others that he had drowned near the bridge. The truth, like damp paper, disintegrated upon handling. Her reflections grew more inward. She did not think herself brave, only persistent, like moss, which endures without meaning to. Yet persistence can become strength in quiet eras. During one walk to the riverside, she came across a flake of blue glass washed among reeds, smaller than a thumbnail, faintly curved. She lifted it, holding it to the dawn, and wondered if the river itself was returning her reminders, fragment by fragment, as though conscience were sediment rising after a storm. That evening she sat by her stove, reading her notes aloud to the empty room. All she had learned, all she had guessed, every death marked in calm ink. She realized that though she still breathed, parts of her life had already turned to history. She no longer hoped for justice within courts or headlines. Truth, she understood, does not need witnesses so much as caretakers. The widow downstairs knocked once, bringing her soup. They talked of the cold and of children gone to work in factories. Their words stayed plain, necessary. Ordinary lives still demanded sustenance, even while hidden wars played out between scholars and tradesmen, between wages and secrecy. The herbalist felt an odd tenderness for such simplicity, a reminder that decency itself was the rarest cure. Later she opened her chest again, not to touch the blue bottle but to check if time had altered it. The wax seal, though cracked, still held. Its color remained that deep, radiant calm that deceives the careless. She placed her palm against the glass, and for a moment warmth returned through it, as if granting her invisible companionship. Then she tucked it away and swept the floor clean of dust and ash. Outside, lanterns blurred in mist, chimneys sighed. The city seemed lighter, though no wrongs had been righted. Yet she knew now what her role would always be. Not accuser, not martyr, but witness. To hold truth until it could walk without crutches. In the empty quiet, she began sorting her herbs again, grateful for their patience. Some sprouted new shoots despite the cold. Others browned and yielded dust when crushed, reminding her that even in the smallest decay there resides the promise of transformation. That night, before laying down to rest, she thought of those archives, the sleeping letters, the hidden names. Somewhere among them, she imagined her own notes might one day lie, tucked between forgotten invoices and breathless confessions. Not out of vanity, but because every age needs one careful recorder of its silence. Rain returned by dawn, gentle and rhythmic, seeping through the streets as steady as memory. The sound mingled with the crackle of her stove, a private duet of endurance and warmth. She closed her eyes and listened. For the first time in years, the city no longer frightened her. It merely breathed, like an animal she had finally learned to live beside. Summer, when it finally settled upon Prague, arrived not with sun, but with warmth that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. The air had lost its edge, even suspicion dozed in the noonday glare. For the herbalist, these days felt stretched thin, as though the world had forgotten how to hurry. Yet under that calm surface, she sensed the slow workings of decision, like roots creeping unseen beneath pavements. The pattern she had traced for months was almost complete. One afternoon, she received a visit that drew the circle closed. A messenger in neat uniform knocked at her door, requesting that she attend to the illness of an official's household. The request was polite, sealed with the crest of the health office. She recognized the symbol from her nights in the archive, from the letter she had copied in secret. The invitation was bait or chance. Either way, it demanded acceptance. She packed her satchel calmly, carrying only ordinary herbs and the steady weight of knowledge. The carriage waiting outside belonged to privilege, brass fittings, polished trim, curtains drawn. She entered without comment and watched the streets pass in fragments through the fabric, spires dissolving into light. The ride ended at the city's edge, where hills rolled toward vineyards grown pale from smoke. The estate beyond the gate stood quiet, its gardens manicured to stillness. She could hear bees, but no laughter, the silence of a house that feared itself. Inside, the servant led her through a corridor lined with portraits. Their painted eyes stared too knowingly, as if each face had rehearsed guilt. The patient waited upstairs, the official whose signet had once sealed the poisoned correspondence. He looked far thinner than his reputation, the vitality drained from his movements. When she entered, he studied her with a mixture of fatigue and wary amusement, guessing that her presence was no accident. He gestured for her to sit. "They say your tonics have few equals," he began. His voice was smooth, but lacked conviction. She mixed a mild tea from her pouch. No poison, only balm for the nerves. He accepted it, though his fingers trembled slightly. For a while they exchanged the kind of words that pass politely between strangers who both know too much about the weather, about ailments of age, about charity for the poor. Only when the room grew still did she ask softly, "And what do you fear most? Illness or memory?" He looked at her without surprise. A faint smile crossed his lips. "Both are loyal companions," he said. She laid her satchel upon the table and placed upon it a folded paper, the copy of his own letter, the one she had found in the archive. The wax seal had long since crumbled, but the crest remained visible. He studied it for a long time, then poured wine into a glass with deliberate calm. "So," he murmured, "the city's whispers have chosen an unlikely guardian." She did not answer. Truth, at that moment, required neither defense nor attack. It only required presence. He sighed and leaned back, the faint clatter of his rings on the goblet. "What would you have me do? Confess to scholars who owe me their wages? To officials who prefer rumor to proof? The poison began long before my hand signed those receipts." She knew he was right, in part. Guilt in cities seldom belonged to one person alone. It was divided thinly, like the taste of metal in well water, pervasive, invisible, shared. Yet she also knew that his confession, spoken aloud or not, could stop the quiet killing. His illness, she realized, was not bodily but moral, the sickness of those who realize too late that power cannot bargain with consequence. When he finished the tea, he reached for his pen. The quills scraped the paper softly, writing without hesitation. He did not name accomplices, merely attested to the falsification of the university shipments and his role in approving them. It was half admission, half resignation. When he slid the page toward her, he said only, "This will outlive me longer than reputation will." She pocketed the note wordlessly. He watched her with weary curiosity. "You think this saves anything?" "I think it saves the truth," she said. He laughed weakly. "You sound like the dead scholar. He too believed in saving things unseen." Outside, a storm began rolling across the hills. The first drops struck the windows as she rose to leave. He did not stop her. She sensed he would not survive the season. His confession had already sapped what resolve remained. Downstairs, the servant handed her a pouch of coins. She accepted enough for the journey back and left the rest upon the hall table. Payment, like sin, should be kept proportionate. By the time she returned to the river quarter, rain had cleansed the streets. The lamps mirrored in puddles looked like small suns trapped in earth. In her room, she laid the signed page beside the blue bottle. Proof and symbol joined at last. Then she sat by the fire, letting the dampness leave her bones. Days folded quietly into weeks. Rumor spread again, first of the official's failing health, then of his sudden death, said to follow a severe fever. No one spoke of scandal. The city, skilled in forgetting, turned its face once more toward progress and markets. But unnoticed by most, the supply of tonics changed. New shipments, stricter labels, quieter consciences. It was not justice, not entirely, but it was motion in the right direction. She continued to work, though less in public. Her stall passed to another widow, who handled it kindly. The herbalist now preferred her solitude, taking patients by word alone. Some said she had grown strange, too much in her own head, though those who sought her help always left lighter of heart. She smiled more easily now, but her eyes betrayed tired knowing, the kind that no laughter can erase. One evening, the widow downstairs entered to ask whether she would attend the funeral of a certain gentleman buried near the university. "He helped the poor, they say," the widow murmured. "Strange, isn't it, how the city suddenly remembers gratitude?" The herbalist shook her head gently. "Let the living have their stories," she said. When the widow had gone, she opened the window. The air smelled of wet lime and something softer, a promise of renewal, perhaps. Beneath her hands lay the confession, folded but never delivered. She thought of taking it to the constables, then decided against it. The man's words had done their work. Printing them would only wake new scavengers. Some truths must rest like seed buried in earth, awaiting proper season. That night, she walked down to the river where the current whispered against the stones. From her pocket, she drew the copy of that confession, not the original, and scattered it in pieces across the water. The paper darkened, curled, vanished. Beside it, she held the blue bottle for a long moment. Its glass reflected both dusk and flame from the city's distant lamps. Then she placed it within a hollow of reeds, sealed tight, and left it there. The river carried both offerings, paper and bottle, toward the heart of the city, where bridges arched like ribs over its slow breath. Perhaps truth, too, required such release, to stir among currents rather than freeze on shelves. Watching the ripples fade, she felt not triumph, but humility. The world seldom rewards quiet victories, but silence has its own music, more lasting than applause.
Walking home under the dripping eaves, she found herself smiling for no reason she could name. The pavements shone, the lamps shivered.
Somewhere a musician played a thin tune on a corner flute, sweet and cracked. She thought of her grandmother's hands, of the first herbs gathered by moonlight, of lessons disguised as warnings. Every sound of the city seemed to belong to those memories now, as if the present had folded back upon its beginning. When she reached her door, she paused to breathe the scent of rain-soaked nettles rising from pots on the balcony. Beneath that familiar bitterness hid something else, faint but alive. The recognition that her life, once bound by fear and secrecy, had turned outward again, toward the simple rhythm of care. Work would call her tomorrow, as always, humble and steady. The city would sleep, unaware that one pair of hands had altered its course by only a whisper. Inside, she set her kettle upon the stove, added a sprig of mint, and listened to the soft hiss of boiling water. The wind fluttered in the corridor, carrying with it the distant tolling of bells. And for the first time in many years, the sound did not recall danger, but rest. The years that followed moved quietly, without the weight of news or the rush of consequence. The city changed around her, as cities do. New chimneys rose, bells took on sharper tones, and strangers replaced familiar faces in the marketplace. Yet her days flowed the same. Small errands, measured steps, mild greetings, the steady rhythm of life pared down to essentials. Habit, that most faithful of companions, had at last become her shelter. She now lived at the city's edge, where gardens claimed what industry had not yet swallowed. The house was modest, 2 rooms deep, its windows framed with vines of ivy and early mint. From her door one could see the river glint faintly through a veil of willows, carrying whatever secrets remained of Old Prague. The air here was softer, touched more by soil than smoke. When she worked by the open window, the scent of nettle and thyme drifted out and mixed with the wind, making the whole place smell faintly of safety. Age had not undone her, though it had quieted her gestures. Those who met her at the market called her the herb woman with the calm voice. Few remembered the stories that once surrounded her name. Those who did chose not to mention them. The city, generous in forgetfulness, allowed her to live as if untouched by scandal. And perhaps it was true. She had done nothing that demanded erasure, only the kind of work no one celebrated while it happened. Each morning began before light. She fetched water from the well, feeding it into a small copper kettle while her cat circled her ankles. Then she stepped into the garden, barefoot on damp soil, to check which plants had braved the night cold. She spoke little to them, though her mind often answered what the leaves seemed to whisper. Questions about endurance, about the usefulness of remaining unseen. Plants, after all, were philosophers of silence. By noon, she received her visitors, a baker's wife with her annual cough, an apprentice blacksmith whose hands burned from lime, a widow seeking remedy for sleeplessness. None lingered long. Her remedies worked slowly, without promise, asking for patience in return, much like life itself. She no longer distinguished between healer and confessor. People came to her not merely for herbs, but for the relief of being heard without judgment. Sometimes she caught herself remembering the scholar's thin handwriting, the blue glass glinting under lamplight, the river swallowing its confessions. But memory had gentled with time. its edges worn smooth. The weight of guilt had transformed into a quieter awareness. Not pride, never triumph. Only understanding. She had learned that justice is rarely a verdict. It is a direction one keeps facing, even when walking alone. The city, for its part, had moved on. The newspapers now printed stories of railroads and exhibitions, of modern medicine and imported machines. Apothecaries used polished scales and wore coats whiter than snow, their talk thick with Latin. Yet even they sent messengers to the herbalist when the new remedies failed, or when a patient sought comfort rather than cure. Progress had not replaced human frailty, only renamed it. She once visited the old quarter where her shop had stood. The building was gone, replaced by a tailor's house. She watched the door for a while, half expecting to see her younger self emerge with baskets and lists. Instead, only the hum of a sewing machine answered, a rhythm not unlike her old mortar. It pleased her, strangely, to see life folded neatly upon itself, each generation stitching its small piece into the endless fabric. In her home, books were few. Her treasures were simpler, a wooden balance, a faded notebook of her grandmother's remedies, and a small bundle of dried flowers wrapped in linen. Of the blue bottle, only the memory remained. She had never gone back for it. Some part of her believed the river had kept what was needed, perhaps carrying it toward places where truth had not yet been planted. There was comfort in leaving certain things unfinished. From time to time, local children followed her along the road, curious about her plants. She taught them, as her grandmother once had, to tell dock from sorrel, to pick nettles without sting, to respect anything that grows stubbornly. They laughed when she told them that every blade of grass has a story for those patient enough to listen. When they scattered, chasing one another's voices, she felt the kind of joy that does not demand witness. Winter returned, and with it, the long evenings of firelight. She mended her shawl, drank mild teas, and wrote small notes that no one would ever read. Observations of tastes, seasons, smells. Pages filled with the steady pulse of an unremarkable existence. Yet between those lines, a quiet philosophy unfolded, that to live kindly amid imperfection is the only alchemy worth mastering. One night a traveler knocked, lost on his way to the city fairs. She offered shelter and soup. Over supper, he spoke of Prague's new hospital, its electric lamps, its glass instruments that gleamed like captured stars. He said the physicians prided themselves on purity, everything measured, everything proven. She listened, smiling at the way his words glowed with faith. When he asked her what she thought of such wonders, she answered gently, "Light is a gift, but it does not teach us where to look." He blinked, unsure if that was wisdom or jest. When spring arrived again, her garden reached upward with energy she once thought only youth could claim. She added a new herb bed, planting seeds collected years before, saved for no reason but hope. The shoots emerged timidly at first, then spread in graceful disorder. They reminded her of Prague itself, untidy, wounded, irrepressible. As seasons blurred, she began to rise later, her steps careful but not weak. Work took longer, yet she hurried none of it. Each act, grinding bark, stirring mixture, tying bundles, became a form of prayer. The rhythm of her days, unbroken by expectation, resembled the slow breath of someone who had finally learned to rest within the world rather than apart from it. Neighbors often spoke of how peaceful her home seemed, as though the walls themselves had grown accustomed to gentleness. They said her house smelled of healing even when no herbs burned. She never corrected them. Superstition sometimes preserves truth better than reason can. Toward the end of one evening, while clouds swept low over the hills, she sat at her window watching the last smoke from nearby chimneys settle into dusk. The river's surface caught fragments of that fading glow, scattering them like coins of light. The sight stirred something deep inside her, a quiet gratitude for having lived, for having known both fear and compassion, and for having understood that they are twins rather than enemies. Before extinguishing her lamp, she reached for her grandmother's old notebook and slipped between its pages a single leaf of fresh mint, still green and fragrant. It was her habit to mark time that way, not with words, but with life itself. The scent filled the room, mingling with traces of lavender and iron from the kettle. She lay down while the wind murmured against the shutters. The city beyond her window no longer demanded attention. It simply existed, humming with invisible stories, as it always had. Somewhere in a distant quarter, a bell tolled the hour, then fell silent. Morning came gently, without the usual noise of the new day. Light entered her room like a forgiving breath, touching the shelves, the stove, the notebook. The fire had gone out, but the air still smelled faintly of herbs and warmth, the scent of work well done. Outside, her garden stirred, dew gleaming on the mint, sparrows flitting through fennel stalks, bees waking from their slow dreams. The world, unhurried, continued its quiet labor. And inside, upon her table, the kettle waited, ready to begin again.